And we're talking about unprecedented events related to the COVID pandemic that have highlighted the need for strong and vibrant public services. So that is the key focus of our discussion tonight. The disastrous outcomes for our elderly residents in private long-term care facilities, as opposed to publicly controlled ones, are a painful example of this reality, how COVID just really highlighted the need for public services. Around the world, however, people are resisting neoliberal privatization agendas and building better, more democratic and inclusive public services. This opposition to privatization has quickly turned into a realistic demand, that of remunicipalisation, renationalization, public ownership. This term captures the idea of not only reversing privatization, excellent, but also developing new public services that can help us meet the social, ecological, and democratic challenges of our time. In a context of climate emergency, mounting inequalities, and growing democratic unrest, public services are more important than ever. Tonight, our three speakers, each of whom will be discussing aspects of public ownership locally, broadly, and globally. Our first speaker tonight is Baba I. Our second speaker is Kevin Scarrett. And Baba is from the health and social sector with the Public Services International. Kevin Scarrett is from the Canadian Union of Public Employees, National Senior Research Officer. And then we have our very own Dominic Bellissimo, who is a Public Sectors Workers Club member and Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation member. Please note that the chat will be open for comments, as I mentioned before, throughout the discussion, but it won't be until the end that we can actually start to touch on some of the questions you may have, okay? But feel free to post them, as they come to your mind, and just capitalize them, please, so I can easily pick them up from the chat. We will not be allowing any negative comments that include vulgar language, abusive comments, or divisive, disruptive behavior. Thank you again for joining us for this Future is Public Conversation. Now, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Baba I, who's joining us from Geneva. So, he's, what time is it there again, Baba? I gotta unmute you. There you
All
go.
right, yeah. It's almost 2 a.m. now. It's about 1:45 in the morning.
Oh, so thank you for joining us. Baba, as I mentioned before, I'll just give a bit more of a formal bio before you speak. Is the Health and Social Sector Officer with Public Services International, hence being in Geneva. He has an international master's in labor policies and globalization. An activist of over 3 decades, he fights for a better world where development brightens the lives of the many and not just the 1%. Baba has published book chapters, working papers, and journal articles on health and social care, industrial relations, development economics, migration, workers' education, identity politics, women's liberation, precarity, and globalization. Wow. So you have a very broad wealth of knowledge. He is also the author of Era of Crisis and Revolts, Perspectives for Workers and Youth. Baba, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Anytime you're ready, let us know.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. This is an interesting discussion, on which I'm happy that I got invited by the Public Sector Workers Club to speak to. I would want to look at the issue of growing public services within the context of COVID-19 in mediating impact of these, and relating it also to issues of systemic racism. And in this regards, I would want to say the place to start from might be, in my view, looking at some of the key reasons why you have had such impact of COVID-19 and its impact on the poor, on black and minority ethnic groups, and to use the British term for such. It's largely a legacy of 4 decades of privatization and cuts in funding of public services. Actually, I mean, these are like two leprous hands of the same body of neoliberal capitalism. The cuts in public funding of healthcare, of social care, for education, housing, etc. It's partly used to, I mean, part of it, austerity measures, partly used to justify privatization with the arguments of greater efficiency, private sector bringing in funds. But this is a fraudulent argument. Rather, the private entrepreneurs come in and walk away with money that could have been used, to better the lot of millions of people. And that is why you've had this move, this drive for remunicipalisation and renationalization, as Jennifer earlier pointed out. And there are 4 very important things to note on why this is necessary and this is beneficial. In the first place, I mean, investment in public services, it helps to expand the service infrastructure. Monies that otherwise would have been siphoned off as profit could be used to expand the services, could be used to improve the quality of service and to lower charges. I mean, for example, the British NHS between 2010 and 2009 lost well over £2 billion from privatization, public-private partnership, which is nothing but, I mean, a euphemism for privatization, really, So outsourcing, contracting out, and all this, they have these economic consequences of taking money off, but they also undermine accountability. Because you can't hold the for-profit, the profit-driven private provider to account as you would elected persons. And there are some examples of how remunicipalizations have resulted in the bettering of lots of people in different countries, for example, and in different sectors also. Before 2016, in Kerala, India, which I'm sure, I mean, most of you would have heard of, you had the schools were essentially private, but they were not making money, and they collapsed. And when the Kerala government took over, a communist government in Kerala, it became fully public. And for the first time in a decade, you actually had a sharp upturn in students, in pupils coming into this, over 12,000. And you can also see improvements in the quality of this. So, I mean, you see this also in different aspects. You see it with water, you see it in healthcare. So all this, all these attacks, privatization is attacks on our right to a better life. And apart from the general impact on citizens, privatization has also gone with cuts in wages. Governments do this with the cuts in funding of social services, like in the United Kingdom, a 1% cap on wages put up in 2010 resulted essentially in not less than 14% cuts in the real wages of health workers. And now you see the same governments, I mean, the same government of the same class of people, rather, clapping for workers, for health workers, whilst surely about decommodification. Because what privatization does is it turns any and everything about our social life, and even in a sense our private life, to commodities, to profits. And when they get this profit also, they are siphoned off. It's not as if they are invested in, and not just even just siphoned off into the pockets of the capitalists, of the bosses there. But they are siphoned off into tax havens. You're talking of some like 30 trillion US dollars in tax havens. I mean, that is significant money that could be, I mean, it's several times much more than what the Marshall Plan that was used to rebuild Europe after World War II, I mean, amounted to. So the people are poor. The world is, I mean, what I'm trying to say essentially is this. We might not have been able to foresee in specific terms COVID-19, but even the fact that you have such increases in zoonotic diseases expresses it reflects the increasing commodification of life itself, including of taking over the wild entry the wilderness and all of which is driven by the profit motive. But the fact that privatization this past 40 years, this past 40 plus years, have been the basis, even informing government, you see, not only just privatization, you see attempts at even bringing the ethos of the private into public management by several governments. So all these have made the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic as terrible as it is now. It is why public personal protective equipment are not available for health workers, because it was several scenarios had shown that you could have something like this, but no, I mean, it was not profitable to stockpile money. Everything had to be at I mean, it had to be if it was a public, the public ethos was as strong as it should be, you would have this, but rather no, it couldn't be stored adequately. And now you have one out of every 7 person infected being health workers, with consequences on even their being able to then deliver healthcare services. And when we invest in the public services, and that is part of why it is essential, to fight for a future of the public services. When we invest in the public sector, this would not be the case. There are 2 other things I want to stress along with this. Strong public services, but also strong unions in the public services. Because studies have shown that, I mean, it is not only that you have had greater fatality rates in private care homes, but that you have had even higher ones where you do not have strong unions. So democratization, involvement of the unions, involvement of the communities in the public service delivery, in ensuring not only increased investment in public services, but also increased participation from below of working people in public services is essential for ameliorating the conditions, the impact of COVID-19, but also for building a better world. So I would want to stop here in calling for workers, the communities, to unite and fight for better public services, greater funding in public services, and greater involvement, greater power in determining our public future. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. I have some questions for you after, Bubba, but thank you so much for that. So our speaker number 2, Kevin Scarrett. Kevin is a senior research officer, assigned to pensions for CUPE. He's currently on a leave of absence. He was a co-editor of the Cornell University Press volume, The Contradictions of Pension Fund Capitalism. For fall 2020, he will be serving as a visiting professor at Carleton University's Institute of Political Economy. Kevin, Let me just, oh, you're unmuted. Okay, perfect. Kevin, would you like to join this discussion and give us your thoughts on this topic?
Okay, very good. Thank you very much to organizers. Thank you to Baba. That was a fantastic overview of the very big picture at the international level. And I hope that what I'm going to bring tonight will complement and in fact illustrate some of the points that Baba just made in a very concrete and troubling way in terms of the recent experience in long-term care in Canada. And maybe I'll just say a couple of things just by way of further introduction. I am a researcher for CUPE, as Jennifer said in my introduction. For tonight, I am on leave of absence right now, and for tonight, I'm not representing CUPE, not officially speaking on behalf of CUPE. I have been active in recent months with the Ottawa Health Coalition, including on this issue. So that's how I would identify for tonight. And what I'm going to talk about is kind of reflecting further on an article that I published recently in a publication called The Bullet. And the title of the article, to give you an idea, is, if I'm remembering, Pension Fund Capitalism and the COVID-19 Pandemic, the Case of Revera. And some of the listeners may recognize the name Revera as one of Canada's large for-profit corporate chain of long-term care providers. And I wrote this article, and it was just published a couple of weeks ago, because I've known for some time that this large and significant provider of long-term care in the country is not just a for-profit provider, but it is actually owned entirely by one of Canada's large pension funds, the Public Sector Pension Investment Board, which is the investment entity of the pension funds of federal public service workers, RCMP employees, and members of the Canadian Forces and Reserves. So this is a peculiar relationship between what is essentially a workers' pension fund and this predatory and exploitative for-profit provider of healthcare in Canada. And so I've known about this for some time, and this is part of a kind of a research project that I've had for some years around what pension funds have actually been investing in particularly Canadian funds. But it wasn't until the pandemic and the tragedy that we have been witnessing for the last number of months in terms of death rates and the terrible circumstances that so many residents and family members and workers have found themselves in this sector, that I was motivated to actually write about this and put two and two together and talk about how problematic this is. So that's my subject for tonight. I'm going to just narrow my comments, though, to a couple of points. First of all, I'm going to say very briefly a word or two just about for-profit provision of long-term care and care work in this sector. I don't think I have to say too much more because I agree with what Baba said, and I'm guessing our audience tonight is already fairly convinced that for-profit healthcare provision is a problem. But I do have a point or two just to reinforce maybe people's thoughts about it. People may have heard this statistic, but I have two statistics to share. One of them is when people started counting the deaths, the mortalities, and the circumstances of related to COVID-19, related to the pandemic, starting in May, June, July, it came to be realized that in Canada, something in the range of 82% of COVID-19 deaths have taken place in long-term care, which is often defined broadly as either formal long-term care or group congregate retirement living facilities, retirement homes, in other words, that are sometimes private and not publicly subsidized. 81%. Just so you know, that is the highest mortality rate associated with long-term care among 17 OECD countries that have been assessed. Canada is off the charts in terms of the concentration of our death rates in long-term care facilities. The other statistic, really important, there has been some comparing. In Canada, we have a mixed system in Ontario and in Canada, we have both public and private for-profit long-term care facilities. We also have a third category of private but not-for-profit. When the not-for-profit has been compared to the for-profit, they've found that the death rates in the for-profit long-term care facilities are 4 times higher than in the public facilities. There is a systematic pattern of higher death rates. And in a nutshell, this should surprise no one, given the reality that Baba talked about. And I think we know, when you provide managers with an incentive, a direct and obvious incentive to minimize labor costs, to minimize expenditure on care, and even things such as cleaning and protective equipment and any number of other things, because when they minimize those costs, they will pocket profits. That's what happens. There is always going to be a contradiction of interest, a conflict of interest there, and the loser will be residents and safety and security. Those are powerful statistics that I think just reinforces the point. And the last point, just on this, in case any further reinforcement is needed, I came across a powerful article. Certainly trade unions representing long-term care workers and others have produced a body of very persuasive work around for-profit provision. But an academic article was published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, not a radical journal, in late July of this year, which summarized an analysis of the death rates in Canadian long-term care, broken down by for-profit and public and not-for-profit. And they came to these same conclusions. I just want to share, though, in the introduction to that article, they made some general observations. And this is, this is doctors and technicians writing this piece. They summarized recent research on for-profit provision of long-term care. And this is what they said. They said, for-profit long-term care homes have larger COVID-19 outbreaks and more deaths of residents. Recent research has concluded that for-profit homes, and I'm quoting here, tend to deliver inferior care, which they summarize as lower levels and quality of staffing, more complaints from residents and family, higher rates of emergency department visits, more acute care hospital admissions, and higher mortality rates. That's the Canadian Medical Association Journal. It's not CUPE, it's not Advocates, it's a medical journal, reinforcing all of what we know would be the case. So it shouldn't be surprising. But let me turn to the second point and really the key message. So, as I said at the beginning, one of the key players in this industry in Canada is Revera, and Revera has been operating since 2006 in Canada under that name. And it was established when an entity called Public Sector Pension Investment Board, which is itself a federal crown corporation established 20 years ago to do the investing for these federal government workers' pension funds, they started to see opportunities for investment in emerging sectors, such as this one. And they saw profits to be made. And so they bought an existing chain of long-term care, for-profit long-term care facilities, and started building it beyond what it had been. They acquired a component in the United States. There's even a section in the UK. And they have owned and operated that company ever since. And here's the key. They own it directly 100% on a private equity basis. What that means is they're not an investor. They don't have a few shares in the company. They are the company. They own it outright. PSP names the board of directors of Revera. They control it entirely. And interestingly, the first chair and still on the board of directors of Revera is former PC Premier Bill Davis. People may know that there's a pattern of interrelationships between the for-profit long-term care industry and Ontario's Progressive Conservative Party, now in government. And this is a part of a disturbing pattern. The simple point to make is my experience as a QP researcher working on pensions. When you talk to workers, when you talk to pension plan members, they don't want their pension plan or the pension fund that's investing their contributions and employer contributions to be exploiting, to be profiting on the exploitation of other workers or the deprivation of service to important populations as the basis of the profits and the rate of return that's being generated to pay their pensions. They don't want that. They tend to be very socially concerned and responsible, and I would argue most federal public service workers and beyond would be horrified to learn that this is what their pension fund has been doing. And of course, for that reason, Revera and the PSP have been very quiet and secretive about what they do. And because it's a private equity company, there are no disclosure obligations. It's not even like Chartwell or Extendicare, where they have to report their profits, their financial processes. In the case of Revera, it is entirely a secret. We don't know how much profits Revera has been generating since 2006. And we have no access to know. Even access to information is not an avenue because there are a number of ways to exempt themselves from that. So this is a major problem. And I'll wrap up with this more hopeful point, because really the reason that I wrote this article and the reason that I was involved in a town hall meeting last week and speaking tonight, and I hope to be doing more of this, is it was an important turning point around Revera and PSP in this particular issue when the Public Service Alliance of Canada, PSAC, the largest of the federal government public service workers unions, representing, among others, the members of the pension plans at issue here, they came out with a statement on May 26th, not just condemning the fact that their pension fund owned Revera and was profiting from this tragedy and profiting from this industry that should be public. They said that, but they also called for the transfer of ownership of Revera into public hands. Now, this is in my view, a remarkable development, and I would say an unprecedented one. I've been following this for 25 years. I don't know of another example of a trade union actually calling for effectively the socialization or the takeover, a public transfer of something that is sitting in their pension fund. And I think that illustrates my point that workers and most unions, when asked, would say they don't want to be profiting from this process when they know that public ownership in an accountable, properly funded way that respects workers and pays wages properly and establishes minimum standards of care could be put into place through public ownership. So I think this has opened up a tremendous opportunity for beyond PSAC, for other unions, for other public sector unions, for all of us who care about long-term care and the privatization of healthcare to get on board. And there is effectively now, I would say, a campaign called Make Revera Public, which is supporting the PSAC call for that transfer. Now, this is going to be a big deal if the federal government, and the federal government could do it in a flash if they decided to. It's owned by a federal crown corporation, but they would need to face pressure. They would need to have a political mobilization because we're talking about a company. I don't know exactly what its value would be, but I would predict it would be worth somewhere between $1 and $2 billion. This is a major deal if this were to happen. It's not a small matter. So, but I see an opportunity. I think there is polls tell us there is huge support for making all of long-term care public and getting profits out of that industry. Some polls say 86% of Canadians would support that move. So we have the public on our side. It's a matter of bringing the political pressure to bear to make it happen. So maybe I probably went over time. I'll stop there, but I'd be happy to talk more if there's questions, and there's a few events coming up in Ontario and other places that are taking this forward. Be happy to talk about that.
Yeah, and Kevin, if you have the links for these events, definitely post it in the group chat too for people, okay? That post the links if you can.
Okay.
That's exciting. Calling for public ownership of a privately owned long-term care. Bring it on. And it's just, you mentioned 86% of Canadians are in favor of doing something like that. And I was just reading, I think it was last week, and I can't remember the exact percentage, but it's over 80% of people are calling for more publicly funded housing right now, because it's been, in the housing sector, it's been moving more and more and more towards privatization and commodification as well. And even the existing public housing structure is just in backlog for repairs. It's just a mess, right? So that's exciting too. So that's coming out of COVID as well, seeing that those aspects highlighted, right? So thank you again. And yeah, we'll have some more questions and discussion at the end. I would like to thank you very much, Kevin. I would like to invite Dominic Bellissimo now. Dominic has worked in the public sector for most of his career. He has worked in children's mental health and in the public education sector. He currently works for an education union and is a longtime member of the Public Sector Workers Club of the Communist Party of Canada. Dominic will speak to us and address some concrete steps that can be taken to strengthen public services in Canada, especially in the education, healthcare, and housing sector.
Well, thanks, Jen. And thanks, comrades, for attending tonight when there were a whole variety of choices of webinars to attend. I think that Baba and Kevin have set up the issue quite nicely for us to discuss where we go from here. Our club and our party feel very strongly that we're at a critical time in Canada. Given the pandemic and the resulting shutdown of parts of the economy. Why? Because we reject the notion that somehow COVID has affected us equally. This notion that we are in this together with millionaires and billionaires, we just outright reject. COVID affects the working class disproportionately, as you've already heard, geographically, economically, racially, and by gender identity. When you think of the bigger victims of COVID and the pandemic, along with our senior citizens, particularly in Canada, I think it's pretty clear who has paid the price. So workers should not be made to pay for the economic crisis that was only exacerbated by COVID, right? Think about the statistics. 4 or if not 5 million Canadians have had to depend on CERB just to survive. That was the replacement for their income that was suddenly withdrawn from them. And not one of them was a millionaire. In fact, I've heard for days in the pages of the business publications that the stock market is humming. It's pretty remarkable that that kind of contradiction would exist today. What we do agree with is that public services are more vital than ever, and that our social programs, despite being outdated, need to be revamped and improved, not scrapped. EI, for example, under the current rules, employment insurance means that 75% of the unemployed will not qualify. It's clearly a valuable but outdated program, constructed with the type of work which existed decades ago and doesn't really resemble the jobs or the workplace of today. So a huge revamp is needed here, but not a scrapping of the principles that we want to see. We also, as a party, believe that privatized public services need to be brought back under public control and not be used for profit or shareholders' benefit. We've seen it's possible. We've heard of examples internationally, and Kevin has certainly given me a great deal of thinking about a Make Rivera Public campaign that the labor movement could fully get behind. Whether in education, healthcare, municipal infrastructure, it's been proven over and over again, as Baba said, that privatization is more costly, less effective for the client, the taxpayer, the parent, the patient, the resident. Just think of hospital construction, for example. The PTHs were disastrous in terms of the overruns and the costs. Governments can borrow money at a cheaper rate without having to worry about profit from these companies. You know, someone commented a couple of months ago at the height of this pandemic when we were all isolated. They said that what seemed impossible a year ago was suddenly doable. In the short term, wages for PSWs, grocery clerks, drivers were suddenly increased. Some of the increases, albeit temporarily, were $2 and $3 per hour. Some workers, after struggling on strike for an improvement in wages that they couldn't get, were suddenly granted pandemic bonuses. So the political will was forced on people. Capital needed to provide those improvements when they had fought against higher minimum wages for decades, when they had said that they couldn't afford an increase in workers' wages. You know, we also saw sick day subsidies appear. We saw childcare centers that were told to remain closed. Money was promised to them. And most importantly, we see the federal government once again talking about national childcare programs. The public is now accustomed to having a government making political choices to benefit working families during a crisis. We think that's what people want done. We think that's what taxes, especially fair taxes in Canada, are for. More money for wages, money for rent, money for students, money to address homelessness. We think that it's absolutely a necessity. You know, someone in their presentation once described taxation as the gift we give to each other. And so people should never apologize that we fight for a fair taxation system, that we support many more taxes on the wealthy, and that we want to shut down some of the tax havens that Baba has referred to. You know, the other thing I noticed during the pandemic is that people's consciousness is now tuned to the reality that these demands were not simply demands to be dismissed from the Communist Party, from the left, or from the labor movement. The average Canadian at times has thought, hey, why should long-term care facilities be privatized? I didn't know that they were. And why should profit be taken while my mother or father have passed away in a private long-term care facility that gave its shareholders a bonus this year? So we think that people want an interventionist government, not afraid to prioritize people over profits. That's exactly what the Communist Party says that we need. So I'm not a big fan of polling, and I heard Kevin say that neither is he. However, in the absence of asking 250 or 500 random friends of ours or your neighbors, polling tells us something. Polling recently has given us a snapshot of what mainstream individuals and workers are thinking. And from what I've seen, I think Kevin is right. Overwhelmingly, the public supports government spending on whatever is required to rebuild and stimulate an economy, to create jobs, to take care of people's needs, even if it means running large deficits for the foreseeable future. They don't support reducing budgets. They don't support the continued austerity plans that conservative and often liberal governments have wanted to swing onto the working class. Polling has also shown that many Canadians believe that critical parts of Canada's social safety net require improvements, especially when it comes to long-term care. And I think Kevin has wisely said as well, we've seen a shift in popular opinion in favor of removing pension fund investments, of removing the profit motive in long-term care ownership. Also, a large majority believes that the improvement that's needed in the public health system should include paid sick days, should include pharmacare, should include livable wages for workers, and it should also include income support and EI that everyone can access. These are really important snapshots on public opinion that we think that we have to take advantage of. And so we think as a party that the time is now to be more militant. The time is now to be more aggressive. The time is now to push labor bodies like the Canadian Labour Congress into more serious demands about the restructuring that needs to happen in society. And why? Because we think it's the right thing to do, and we think that the public is on our side. The CLC recent task force on privatization, Kevin may have played a role on in some of the meetings. It found a number of things in their research and in their recommendations. They recommended that we strengthen and expand public services and infrastructure. That when you think about expanding public services, you expand jobs and well-being for primarily women in society. When you talk about increasing infrastructure spending, don't forget that spending is very, very gendered. It's very male-dominated jobs. You build bridges, you have more construction workers. Overwhelmingly, these trades have men working in these positions. So it's important for us to do both. Look at expanding public services and look at expanding infrastructure spending. We need to expand public revenue. We need to enhance public services. We need to end, the task force report says, the financialization of and the facilitation of privatization, both globally and within Canada. It talks about expanding more and more public control over infrastructure. Now, it calls on our unions to report on, to analyze, to educate workers so that they know how our own money is being used, that they know how our pension funds are being invested. I come from a public education sector where the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan, at last count, is probably the third or fourth largest pool of capital in the country. And beyond the Canada Pension Plan and a couple of others, the CAS in Quebec, and maybe the federal pension plan that exists, the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan is overwhelmingly used, not in workers' favor, to leverage privatizations, to buy up infrastructure around the world, to own airports, to own long-term care facilities if they decided to venture in that direction. So it's really important that we head off this tendency to think that investing our own workers' pension is going to automatically be used in a progressive direction, not when it is the Bay Street and Wall Street bankers that are doing the investment decisions. The task force and I'll stop with this on the report, the task force report also recommends that we work to keep our pensions out of privatizations. And so I'm so glad to hear that the PSAC was one of the first massive unions in the country to talk about demanding action on the public ownership of Rivera. Well, finally, in closing, because I think it's more important that we come up with ideas and comments and suggestions tonight together, comrades, our party and our club believe strongly that we'll continue to fight for a people's recovery. That includes a number of demands that will be listed in the chat in a second. A guaranteed annual livable income to replace the subsistence level social assistance that we've currently got across this country. To fight for free universal childcare. To build at a minimum 1 million units of social housing, better pensions, higher minimum wages. We don't just want to increase the minimum wage that'll allow people to barely survive. We want to find a living wage that's geared to where workers live in the country. A key industry we think should be put under public ownership. Decade ago, everybody said, oh, that's a communist dream. You can't accomplish that until you have socialism. And yet, though, when General Motors announced that they were closing their factory in Oshawa, if you talk to friends nowadays, they say, hey, that's not a bad idea. Let General Motors provide PPE. Let them assemble ventilators. Let them assemble medically needed equipment for the domestic market and focus less on producing automobiles globally so that General Motors can make more profit. Whether they produce electric cars at the same time, those are just naming a few of the things that a publicly owned General Motors could do in Canada. So I urge comrades to check out our People's Recovery Plan that you'll see in the chat, and that I also think we need to struggle with, while we're currently in this pandemic situation, how do we keep workers mobilized until we're able safely to come together, to organize on the ground, to see each other face to face, to protest outside of Parliament or Queen's Park? It will be important for us to continue to keep workers motivated and to keep people interested in struggling for a progressive agenda here in Canada. I think we can do it together. I think we can do it if we move the labor movement, working along with community allies to demand that all of these public services be strengthened and kept in public hands. Thanks, comrades. I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dominic. Very good. That's the end of our speakers panel. However, I know that there's some questions that we want to ask and put out there to the speakers. I'm going to ask one, and then I'm going to have Helen ask a couple. But please, if there's something that anybody wants to ask, if you could put them in capitals along in the chat bar, that would be great. I don't think, I mean, it's not a huge group. I feel like if people want to ask themselves, if you're able to, just kind of stick up your hand. I'll keep an eye on it, and I can shoot it over to you. You just make sure you have to unmute yourself, because I mean the protocol can shift a little bit because it is just, I think we're at 14 people. So, but yeah, there was a question that a couple of our club members had for you guys, Bubba or Kevin. One thing that I think would be nice to hear your thoughts on is what would a post-COVID-19 look like for public sector workers? And Bubba or Kevin, either one of you can pick up on that. Just make sure you're unmuted.
Okay, I'll take that. And there was a question about is there any hope for? Okay, yeah, you posted that to Jenny, and then
Okay.
there's one. Is there hope for winning back more public-owned services, especially healthcare? Okay, yeah. Well, on what would the post-COVID-19 world be for public sector workers? I would say it partly depends on us, how we fight. It partly depends on us. For example, and I give this allegory sometimes, that it's rather funny, the kind of funny that you don't laugh at, that after the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009, the bosses managed to get away with insisting that the remedy for the sickness was more of the concoction that caused the ailment in the first place. You saw that, I mean, despite that crisis, you had much more revamped privatization, austerity measures, and so on and so forth. And I say, and then I looked at it that this was the other way around. When you had the Great Depression and then the wars, it ended up with what Ken Loach described as the spirit of 45, you know, the welfare state and all that. And somebody argued that it's like if you were in hell and you try to negotiate with the devil for a cooler place in hell, he knows that you're not serious about it. And but if you're in the hell and you like fight to get the hell out of hell, the devil would at the very least call you for a negotiation on how you get a corner with air conditioning in hell. And that was the difference between 2009 and 1940s and what have you. You know, it's that we cannot get a better deal if we don't fight for something beyond what this system wants can give. You know, we have to be, I mean, like the General Secretary of the PSI said, if we cannot, Rosa Pavanelli said, if we cannot be as radical can be now, when? You know? So it depends on how are the demands we place forward and how bloody well we're ready to fight for this. So that's my take on that. You know, it's not given. They're not going to give us because it's the right thing to do. You can even see some of what were done. I mean, the requisition of hospitals in Spain and things like. At the earliest opportunity, they'll take this back, except we fight to defend and extend this.
Yeah, totally. And that's to Dominic's point too about becoming, now's the time to be militant, right? So like for strong public services, we need strong unions. You mentioned that earlier, Baba. And Doug, you have your hand up, yes? Unmute yourself and then just join in.
Okay. Helen doesn't want to go first?
No, go ahead.
I butted in, Helen, sorry.
That's okay.
Did you? Sorry, apologies, Helen.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so I'm just, you know, it strikes me, we had a little discussion about this in our club a little while ago, that there is like a sort of a shocking contrast between a sort of more public sector led or state led, public sector led response to both growth and to the COVID crisis, and the private sector approach that we see in the United States. And that's what's becoming, I think, the primary source of conflict in the world, which is the conflict between China and the United States. On the one hand, we have had very significant growth for decades now from China, far outweighing anything that we see in America. We've had a 7-decade-long trend of declining growth on a 20-year basis in the United States. They're now down to 2.1% average growth over a 20-year period, a 20-year average period. Now that's the lowest, well less than half of what it was in the 50s. China's responded much more effectively with a much stronger state response to the COVID crisis. That's going to actually increase the differential very significantly between the two. In terms of growth, and I think will shorten the time in which the two become equivalent. And so there's almost like this major battle. It's not almost, there is this major battle between these two different models of development. One which is a more public sector based development model, growing much more effectively, undermining the whole rationale for capitalist style development models. And at the same time, this increasing attack by America on China, and especially on its on the role that the state plays in that. So, you know, we have often these sort of moral arguments about public sector and what it can, and the value that it can provide to working people in terms of security and social services and that. But it strikes me, and I just like to hear comments from the panel, that there also is this situation developing where there is increasing evidence of an inability of the capitalist society to grow in the way that it has in the past and play that dynamic role for leadership in the economy. Right now, over the next 2 years, 50% of world growth, according to the IMF, will come from China, 3% from America, which we are now left out of in Canada because of our decision to side with the Americans over the Meng affair. So, but at the same time, and just my last little point here before I pass it to the panel and ask for comments, is that my fear is that what the capitalist crisis, and this perhaps reflects why the stock market has risen so rapidly in America, is that they are using this crisis to increase their rate of profit, which has been suffering. And by that, they are primarily going to attack and increase exploitation of workers in order to improve their profits and in that way deal with the crisis and improve the investment and get growth back to a more reasonable level at the same time as attacking China. So I fear that in the aftermath of COVID, what we are going to be facing is a very strong attack on our wages and working conditions as a way for the capitalists to resolve this terrible crisis that they've been in, and also so that they can compete more effectively with the Chinese model.
Yeah, and
So,
Doug,
yeah,
and I I think I agree with some of that. Especially given the rates of unemployment being greater than than the numbers of the Great Depression. So that's ripe opportunity for capitalists to start exploiting workers based on their need for jobs, right? So, but going to the panel, Bubba or Kevin, if you want to make some comments on what some of Doug said around the post-COVID for workers, that would be great. Kevin?
Sure, I can offer a quick thought. I don't disagree with Doug's comments. I would only add, I think, in terms of the very big picture of the financial circuits of capitalism. Of course, Doug referred to the way that stock prices and financial markets continue to be inflated and are being sustained. I think we all know and have been watching since the Great Crisis, 2008, 2009, that the primary way that has been sustained is through massive intervention on the part of central banks, quantitative easing. I mean, even in the course of the pandemic, the Federal Reserve has been buying up all of the financial instruments, bonds from any company are simply acquired, and it's been really a massive kind of public subsidy to keep those financial markets going. So Doug is absolutely right that this is papering over deeper crisis dynamics, including chronic stagnation, which Doug referred to. And I think we all would agree that, where will we find ourselves after the pandemic? And hopefully that comes sooner than later. But probably not very different from where we were before, in the sense that we need to be building a stronger political bloc that can make sure that a crisis like this isn't an opportunity for the attacks on workers, the attacks on social programs and public ownership that we have seen in the past. Past crises have not worked out well. If there's ever been a time to wake up and kind of smell the coffee and start building a power base to protect workers and to build a different kind of model, this is definitely it. And if I could just tack in, because I know we're probably short on time, I do think in terms of after the pandemic and even immediately, this crisis in long-term care, this central element of healthcare, which has been exposed, the profit-driven management has been exposed as a disaster, as a tragic disaster. I think there's an opportunity for us to start building that political alternative around that struggle. And so I would just encourage everyone that's online and anyone that might see this as a recorded video afterwards, if you are a member of a union in particular or a retiree organization, please consider asking that your union leadership pass a resolution, make a statement expressing support for the PSAC call to make Rivera public. I will just underline, friends, that so far, not a single union or union local has expressed support for that call. Not one. So that's why I'm mentioning this. This is a welcome mat. I urge all friends and trade union members to ask their union leadership, hey, isn't it time that we get on board with this train? Because I think if we did have that, we could really make some headway and make something very important happen.
Kevin, we haven't actually passed a resolution, but I would just say in the Ontario side of CUPE is that we with the OHC's long-term care rallies, we were going to focus on all the new, making it all the new homes public, and then we were also going to call for Rivera, but for the trade union leaders here in CUPE, they said no, we're going to have to call for them all to be public.
Yep.
But we'll get a resolution on that specifically. I'll raise that with CUPE Ontario and OCHU.
Yeah, and
Very
thanks
good.
for bringing that up, Kevin. That's like, yes, unions need to be on board with that for sure. I have, let me see, Helen, did you want to ask? There was a question right at the top there. Did you want to
Yep.
shoot it over to you? Okay.
The question was around the examples of remunicipalisation, which is quite the word, done with the work of, was it done with the work of the unions, and were they done in areas where there was already a progressive municipal government? I guess this was for Baba. It was around the first section in terms of international examples.
Yeah. There were already, I mean, there was even pre-COVID, between 2000 and 2015, there were not less than 1,408 recorded examples of remunicipalization across some 2,400 cities in 58 countries. The TNI document, which Jennifer shared earlier, which PSI also worked with the TNI on, I also posted a manual on remunicipalization, which has just been recently published by the PSI, documents this across the different sectors: health, waste management, housing, energy, water. So yes, in most of these you have had an active union engagement, and it's almost impossible without, not totally, but only in a few cases where you don't already have a progressive government. Like the example I gave in Kerala, it was partly because this was a communist government state in India. But the thing is, where you have a vibrant union movement, you have progressive municipal and state level governments, yes, it is more likely, but that likelihood is at best a potential without it being mobilized. So I think the important part there is also about not just it's not something static. It's in each of those cases, mass anger against privatization to be mobilized to either call for when contracts of private providers expired, or even in some cases too. I mean, like especially where you had poor delivery on their part, stop this. And a lot of these cases, the vast majority of these, you have seen the remunicipalization leading to improved service delivery, leading to more inclusive service delivery. And this also goes back to, because the means and the ends actually have a dialectical relationship, the involvement of unions, of mass democratic organizations of the people, and of progressive municipal governments.
Thank you so much. I think you answered the next question, because I was like, I like to, oh, sorry, I'll turn my video back on. Apologies. I always like to take away some of these discussions with very concrete ways that we can all kind of leave the discussion with and start to do. Kevin, you mentioned simple thing: get your unions, if you're involved in a union, get them talking about and encouraging them to support the Ontario Health Coalition's fight to take back Rivera from private hands and into public hands. And to Doug's point, just get them to look at the bigger picture as well. Like let's get all of that. Let's go for the big ask and support the small one that's happening, but let's just go big with it. I also would love, Baba, if there's any concrete example, even a small one, that publicly is currently happening that looks really hopeful and positive by the actions of people, whether they're organized workers or not, because not everybody is in a union yet. Hopefully there will be more more union membership happening during COVID. That could be a silver lining. But if there's any sort of thing that you might want to highlight around a positive thing that's happening in the global context.
I would say in the global context of COVID now, the interesting bits was more of the hands of government being forced, to take steps hitherto unimaginable regarding not remunicipalization per se, but you have had cases of requisitioning, of hospitals. Probably the most celebrated of these was in Spain. And I mean, private hospitals were requisitioned when the surge came. And this made it possible. It was cheaper to address it was cheaper engaging with the pandemic in terms of service delivery than in Britain, for example, where at the same time that the Spanish government requisitioned private hospitals, the British government was paying £2.3 million every day for 800 beds. And along with requisitioning, you also had factories. I mean, the example of General Motors was given, but also I remember a joke. I mean, it was a terrible thing with the surge in Italy, but we use face mask produced by Versace and PPE produced by. You had companies, especially in auto industry, in textile industry, being repurposed. So this show that, I mean, the kind of things that the capitalists make appear to be, I mean, this is not rocket science and it's not magic. So it's about that the world does not have to be ordered. It does not have to be based on the drive of the profit motive. That is also at the heart of, that's the essence also of remunicipalization of public services. It's about in different way. It's about winning the battle for democracy and democracy in this sense in terms of rights, not just political rights, but social and economic rights, of the people, of working class people. So these, I think, the issue of remunicipalization per se, as it had been pre-COVID, is more likely to resonate as part of the agenda of a post-COVID struggle. Because when you look at most of the places where pre-COVID you had this, there had to be like mass movements and things like that. Though we had the globalization of the Black Lives Matter, to a great extent, for now, it's better than during the time of the confinement, but there's still some constraint on being able to take up the theater, the arena, of the streets. And I think that this, along with strikes, I mean, if the unions, there will be battles ahead in which I think things will be redefined. It's not given what will happen subsequently, but remunicipalization, I believe, would be on the agenda and in ways that will be more militant. But right now, the best examples, in my view, which bear the spirit of what remunicipalization was about during the COVID period, has to do with requisitioning and repurposing.
Excellent. Thank you. Helen. Oh, unmute Helen there.
I just muted myself there. Sorry. this has been really great. I think it's really, really appreciate everyone's contributions. I just wanted to say that given that we had a throne speech today, we talked very briefly, I think, before it started, that there's some vague promise that, yeah, this time we really mean a national childcare program, but that's something that we can win, you know, I mean, that there's enough pressure. And that would be a huge step forward for women in terms of the women who are predominantly the childcare workers, and also the women whose life is made better by quality public childcare. And I think that having said this, made this vague promise tonight, the biggest concern is that it will be a hybrid model. There'll be public, there'll be private, there'll be this, there'll be that, so that's what I think, the next step in terms of our priorities need to be is like, how do we ensure this national childcare program is public, is affordable, is free? That's what our policy says in the party. But also there's something we can do about housing too. I've been meeting with a group of tenant activists, and it's already been passed by Guelph Labor Council, a resolution that we developed. Now there's a few unions that represent housing workers, but our members are the ones that need this resolution, because they're, especially those precarious workers like school board workers and childcare workers and anyone who's been impacted by the pandemic. They need support in terms of not being evicted, in terms of building the housing stock that we need to properly house people. So I have, if anyone is interested, it was going to the Kingston Labor Council, I think last night, I haven't heard. And we're looking at putting in at Toronto Labor Council, any Labor Council that would do this, to try and then develop a campaign for at the OFL to support, because they're now, the last couple of days, there's been a group of people outside an apartment holding off the sheriff, and they've been successful. But, we need more people to be doing that. We need more policy in order to, they don't have to go chasing after the sheriff every day to see where they're going. So I think that's another really important step that we could take.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and I was just thinking as you were talking, Helen, like the idea that, we each have our sectors and our union sectors that we're involved in, and our professional sectors we're involved in, but the power of workers collaborating for a full broad scale of public services, from housing to water to hydro to daycare to healthcare to all of that, during COVID, there's been such a heightened like a huge light shone on all of these gaps, right? And the literally deadly effects of privatization, long-term care being the perfect example of that, Kevin. So I think that this is a really good opportunity for a lot of us, again, organized and non-organized workers, to really start to mobilize around public services and getting them and just demanding them, right? Like there's a march for housing happening right now in support of the people living in encampments in Moss Park in Toronto. And they're calling for the expropriation of a charity building, the We Charity building. Right? And so let's make those calls. Let's make those calls. In the housing and shelter services, for instance, we've now, reappropriated hotels, like for-profit hotels during COVID, to make sure that people who are homeless are able to social distance and have some dignity during COVID. And this is something that we should have been doing this a long time ago, and we need to continue to do this. It can't just stop because of a pandemic. Like, it has to continue. So that's the other thing that I really believe is important, to make sure that we're doing those calls on the continuation of these emergency services, right? Because they're working now for a reason, so they need to be continued, so that it doesn't have to be a scramble in the next pandemic, if you know what I mean. That being said, I would like to give the opportunity to Kevin and Baba or Dom for any final thoughts, any takeaways that you may have as we start to wrap up this evening's discussion. Kevin?
I don't have a lot to add. Maybe I'll just underline what Doug put in the chat. If people haven't seen it, there is a major mobilization that the Ontario Health Coalition is calling for October 8th. and that's in multiple cities. I know there's an event at the legislature in Toronto at 11 a.m. that people in the Toronto area could check out. We're doing a 3-site action in Ottawa on October 8th, one at 11, one at 12, and one at 1 p.m. The first target of our action in Ottawa is going to be the Carlingview long-term care facility, which is owned and operated by Revera, where dozens of seniors died as a result, I would argue, of their mismanagement. And we're going to have a banner out there saying, "Make Revera public," and issuing that call as part of the larger demand to make all of the for-profit long-term care sector public going forward. So yeah, I encourage everyone to get on board with that and other things that I hope are going to emerge in the coming weeks.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. And Dom, did you have your hand
And
up?
Kevin, we'll be out there supporting the Ontario Health Coalition. We've already publicized that today to our members. The last point I guess I would make is that keep an eye on our pension plans. That as capital experiences this crisis, as there'll be a struggle between who will pay for a recovery and who will not pay for it, I think there'll be more pressure on worker pension plans to make riskier investments, less ethical investments, and that we're really the front line to monitor and keep those bankers in check when they want to invest in stuff. And thanks for being optimistic. It was wonderful to hear some of the examples Baba gave us of thousands of previously privatized public services returning to public ownership. It was nice to hear some good news.
Yeah, 100%. And Baba, what about you? Any final thoughts or comments that you might want to?
Yes. One, I want to say thanks for this discussion. I found it very, very interesting and useful. And I don't know, looking at things from the global perspective with regards to like this Justice Steves. There was when I got this Justice Steves on private care in British Columbia in Canada. I mean, what I first got was an 800-page document, and there was no way I was going to go through that. But just yesterday or 2 days back, I got a 46-page summary of that. And going through that, I think it's a locus of struggle. It's like what we're talking about, really, essentially. I think this is something that does not only strengthen argument for public healthcare, but that could be generalized. And I think that for us also, I'll be writing something on it for other affiliate, because part of what we try to do is to lessons from different countries, exchanges, discuss, and we'll be having our Health and Social Service Global Task Force meeting in 2 weeks' time. We'll look at a number of this thing, but in summing up anyway, I think I'll say these are uncertain times, but we can win. I mean, like Bertolt Brecht, to paraphrase him, I mean, if we fight, we might win. We might not. If we don't, we have lost already. There's everything to win if we fight now. This is the time for us, workers, unionists, socialists, activists, the communities, to rise up and reclaim what is ours. Not only better public services and a better life, but also our dignity and freedom. Thank you.
Excellent last words. Thank you so much for that. It's true. Thank you, everybody, again for joining us tonight. I really enjoyed this discussion, and there's a lot of very good information that has come out of this. Thank you for letting us record this so that we could circulate some of this information in the future if needed. I would also like to encourage everybody again. This forum was hosted in partnership with the People's Voice newspaper. So if you would please consider subscribing to the People's Voice, there's a link in the chat sidebar. And consider if you don't want to subscribe. It's a very low cost subscription, by the way. It's like $35 for the year, and it is worth every single penny and then some. So please consider subscribing or donating. I'd like to extend a deep appreciation, as well as my other comrades from the Public Sector Workers Club, to our speakers tonight, Baba and Kevin in particular, and of course to Dominic, our very own PSW. And if you would like to share your email with us to be invited to future panels that our club will be putting on, please do. You can email me directly at jennifermoxey@hotmail.com. That's JenniferMoxy@hotmail.com. And then I can add you to a list. And in the meantime, everybody, I would like to leave you with a little video. How's that?
Oh.
That's a little video. We have, well, the little video is basically, it's a little video from the link that I posted about the Future is Public link, Dominic, that link that you had sent us for this forum tonight. So now I just need to find it. Did I close it? Oh, I might have, oh no, there it is. Okay, can you see it, everybody? Not yet? Share screen. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
All right. Okay. So everybody, I'd like to say good night again. Thank you for joining us, and until next time. And feel free to stay as a 2-minute video, so you can watch this if you'd like, or you can sign off.
Thanks, Jen.
Take care.
Thank you. Parfait.